The storm did not announce itself gently, it arrived like a judgment, tearing across the plains with a roar that drowned even the lowing of frightened cattle, and Thomas Callahan stood on the porch of his sprawling ranch house staring into the wall of rain, his heart pounding harder than it had in years, because everything he had built, every acre, every fence, every prized head of cattle, was suddenly at the mercy of the sky. The wind bent the old cottonwoods nearly in half, lightning split the darkness like a blade, and the herd, 1,000 strong, was panicking in the lower pastures where flash floods were already forming. Thomas was a rich man by any measure, known across 3 counties as the Iron Rancher, a man who never lost and never needed help, yet in that moment his wealth meant nothing, because money could not stop a river from rising or calm animals driven mad by thunder. He shouted orders to his hands, his voice cracking as they ran into the rain, but the storm was too fast, too violent, and when the first section of fence gave way under the surge of water, Thomas felt something in his chest break as well. Then, through the chaos, he saw her, at first just a shape moving against the wind, a lone figure on horseback riding straight toward the flooding ravine where the cattle were being swept away. She should not have been there. No sane person would ride into that kind of storm, yet she moved with purpose, standing in the stirrups, waving a lantern that somehow still burned, guiding the animals away from the worst of the water as if she understood them, as if they trusted her more than they trusted him. Thomas tried to shout, tried to stop her, but the storm swallowed his voice, and all he could do was watch as she rode the edge of disaster, cutting across the pasture, forcing the lead cattle to turn just before the ground gave way beneath them. Minutes felt like hours, lightning flashed again and again, and when the rain finally eased enough for him to see clearly, the herd was no longer in the ravine, it was moving uphill, alive, saved. The woman disappeared as suddenly as she had come, riding into the curtain of rain toward the Old North shelter, a place no one had used in years. When dawn finally broke, gray and quiet, Thomas rode out himself, mud-caked and shaken, and found her there, standing beside a small fire, soaked to the bone, hands raw and bleeding from the rains, looking less like a miracle and more like someone who had given everything she had left. She met his gaze without fear, her eyes steady, and when he demanded to know who she was and why she risked her life for his cattle, she simply said she did what needed to be done, that storms take enough without people standing by and letting them, and something about the way she spoke, calm, certain, untouched by his wealth or authority, unnerved him more than the storm itself. He offered her money, more than most people made in a year, but she shook her head, saying she didn't help for reward, and that answer stayed with him long after she walked away, because Thomas Callahan had built his empire on the belief that everything had a price, yet here was someone who had just saved his livelihood and wanted nothing in return. As the sun rose higher and the ranch hands gathered, whispering about the woman in the storm, Thomas felt the first crack in the armor he had worn his entire life, a sense that fate had intervened, that the night had brought more than survival. It had brought a reckoning. By the time the land fully dried and the fences were rebuilt, the woman from the storm had already begun to haunt Thomas Callahan's thoughts in ways no rival, no drought, no market crash ever had, because she represented something he could not control or understand, and that disturbed him more than the near loss of his cattle ever did. He ordered his foreman to find her, not with threats or demands, but with quiet questions, and what came back unsettled him further. Her name was Eliza Gray. She lived in a weather-beaten cabin near the edge of the county line, took odd jobs helping neighbors during calving season, refused charity, and had once been the daughter of a respected ranch hand who died years earlier when another wealthy landowner ignored warnings about a failing dam. That last detail hit Thomas like a slow, deliberate blow, because he knew the story well, everyone did. And he knew how money and influence had buried responsibility back then, just as it had buried his own conscience more times than he cared to admit. Against his usual instincts, Thomas saddled his horse and rode out alone to find her, passing land he owned but rarely walked, realizing how distant he had become from the very earth that made him rich. When he reached her cabin, he found her repairing a broken fence, hands moving with practiced ease, eyes lifting only briefly when she saw him approach, not surprised, not impressed, just aware. He told her he needed to understand why she had done what she did, why she risked her life for animals that belonged to a man she didn't know, and she answered without bitterness, saying cattle were innocent, storms were cruel, and standing by while something could be saved was a choice she refused to make. Her words stripped away the excuses Thomas had built his life on, and for the first time he admitted aloud that he had been afraid. Not of losing money, but of realizing how empty his victories felt when faced with real courage. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas found reasons to visit, sometimes bringing supplies she didn't ask for, sometimes just listening as she spoke about land stewardship, about responsibility that didn't end at property lines, about how wealth without care only deepened suffering when disaster came. Slowly, almost against his will, Thomas began to change. He reinforced riverbanks beyond his fences, funded storm shelters for neighboring ranches, treated his hands like people instead of tools, and every act felt less like charity and more like repayment for a debt he had ignored his entire life. When another storm threatened later that season, Thomas didn't wait behind walls or send others into danger. He rode out beside Eliza, guiding cattle together, equal in mud and rain, and in that moment he understood why his men had called her a miracle, not because she defied nature, but because she reminded people who they were supposed to be. By the end of the season, Thomas Callahan was still rich, still powerful, but he was no longer alone, and the ranch that once stood as a monument to pride became a place of shared strength and preparation, its story spreading far beyond county lines. As this story closes, remember that miracles don't always fall from the sky, they ride into storms on borrowed horses and leave behind changed hearts, and if you want more stories that inspire courage, humility, and transformation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the next story might just change the way you see the world too.